Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, Chapter 5, Halacha 5, and the Art Scroll 51a1. Today we're getting into forbidden growth and Kilayim. Now, we learned in the last Mishnah that maintaining Kilayim is going to render produce prohibited from benefit, just like planting Kilayim. Now, Halacha 6, the one that's coming up after this, is going to be what happens if accidentally there was something growing and you find it there. We're going to get into that later, but this now is going to be where you're maintaining it. And one is not considered to be maintaining Kilayim unless he's willingly allowing the Kilayim to grow in his vineyard. And accordingly, when vegetables are going to sprout on their own in the vineyard, there's no prohibition until the owner becomes aware of that. But over here, this is going to be a case of what happens if he neglects it, and he knows about it, but he just neglects it, or he decides to plant it. What's going to happen? Now, this is all important because when the temple gets rebuilt, you can't use the product of Kilayim. That's doraita. So all of the wine that you'd be producing, if there were vegetables or other things that could be there that are growing that are alien to that space, that's going to forbid all of that. You're not going to be allowed to use it, and it's going to be very serious if you do bring something that's that blemished to go onto the altar. Also, you can't use that for the omer. And then there's other things as well. Can you make kiddush on it? No, you can't take wine that's been nullified and by Kilayim issues and then go use it. You can't use it for any benefit. So the Mishnah is saying that if one sees a vegetable growing in the vineyard and he says, when I eventually reach it, I will pick it, then it's going to be permitted for benefit. Now, this is a subtlety in how he's wording it. He's occupied with his work, and basically he doesn't stop what he's doing and run over there to uproot it right away, but he's showing intention to go uproot it. And that's going to count. That intention to go uproot is going to count, and it's going to be permitted for benefit because the vegetable or the vine, he just learned about it, and it can happen where something will grow, and he can go and remove it. Now, even though the growth might increase by 200th from the time that he saw the vegetable, and then he actually gets over there to uprooting it, he's not considered to be maintaining Kilayim during that period because he doesn't neglect to uproot the vegetable. He's just busy with something else, and at his first reasonable opportunity, says the Rosh Cirilio, he will go and get it. He's just postponing it on account of a preoccupation, and there's no prohibition of benefit. He's not neglecting it. He's not saying, I'm going to willingly maintain Kilayim. You're not allowed to willingly maintain Kilayim. Then it continues and says, if, however, he passed vegetable, and he says, when I return, I will pick it, and then if its growth increases by 200th, by 200th, it's forbidden as Kalei Karam. And this is that, look, you had the opportunity now to go pick it, but you neglected it. You went past to go do something else. That now is a little bit different. Before, you saw it, and you're doing something. You say, okay, I'm going to go get it. This other case is a little bit different. This is where you saw it, and then, okay, I'm going to go do other things now, and I'll come back and, whatever. So the first chance he had to pick it, he passed. He went to choose some other activity, and that's what's going to make it forbidden. Now, by giving up this opportunity to uproot that vegetable when it was in front of him and leaving it to grow, he's maintained Kilayim. And now, if that increased in growth from the moment forward, that's considered Kalei Karam, and you can disqualify your vineyard. And, these grapevines take many years to develop. You have to go through the orla process as well, where you can't use the produce. And now you have to rip up the vines and burn them. Very expensive proposition to leave Kilayim in a vineyard. So since Kalei Karam becomes nullified in a mixture of 201, that's going to be known from the Mishnah on Orla 2:1, where 200 permitted parts for every one prohibited part. As long as the increased growth is going to constitute less than 1/200th of the total, it's going to be nullified in the permitted growth that's contained within that produce. Now notice that that's within the plant itself. That's what's so interesting. So if you have 1/200th growing, where's the mixture? The mixture is within the plant. What is going to be the mixture? You're going to have 199 of parts that are fine and 1/200th of a part that's going to be Kilayim within the plant itself. That is going to be amazing. Now, there are going to be some that say that this is going to be a D'Rabbanan rule, and that the D'Oraita rule will be any mixture at all as long as it's the majority. Now, the Mishnah is going to get into this qualification. We're going to get into this qualification of the Gemara that if you're seeing the vegetable growing in the vineyard, and he says, when I reach it, I'll pick it. And in that case, it's going to be permitted. Rabbi Yossi ben Bar Hanina, says that they taught this in regard to a worker. This worker now, in this case, is going to be tending a vineyard and noticing the vegetable there growing among the vines. And he's going to be working the rows of vines, and he's going to see it in the row. It's going to be in front of him. And since he's occupied with his work, and he just didn't get there yet, his tending of the vines is going to be such where he can continue tending the vines, and then when he gets to the vegetable, he can do that. He can rip it up. And that's not going to be considered maintaining Kilayim. But if the owner of the vineyard notices the vegetable of the vineyard, now he's the one who has to drop everything and run over there to rip it out immediately. And if he doesn't do it, now if it increases 1/200th, it's going to be rendered forbidden. So there's a little bit difference where you having ownership seeing something and a worker doing something. This also comes up with shchicha in Peah, where if you have the owner of the trees and they're walking past the trees, and can they come back to collect, or is it going to be left as shchicha? And then in that case over there, it's going to be depending on if it's the owner or not. But over here, it's going to be like that as well. So the Gemara is going to clarify this a little bit more. It's going to say, however, if the owner of the vineyard is occupied with his work and he's tending the vines himself, they treat him like a worker. And as long as it's going to be like what he says in the Mishnah, when I reach it, I will pick it, it's going to be permitted. So if he's going to be like the worker actually tending the vines, just like if he hired a worker himself and he's working the vines, when he gets to it and he rips it out, it's going to be okay. But if he's passing through it, passing by it, or going on to do other things, just like in the case of the olive trees and shchicha, can you come back and do it? And the answer is no, not as the owner. And in the case of a related bryce, it's going to be stated that if the owner of a vineyard maintained field vegetables in a vineyard, and he neglected to uproot wild vegetables that sprouted on their own, and they grew by a 200th, they're going to be forbidden both to him and to others. But if the worker maintained a field of vegetables in a vineyard, and he neglected to uproot them, and they grew by a 200th, they are forbidden only to that worker, but they're going to be permitted to everyone else. Now, what's going to be the difference between this? And, field vegetables are going to be those that are going to grow on their own in the wild, and we covered this in Shvius. You have some field vegetables that grow naturally in the Jerusalem hills, like chicory and fennel and other types of edibles. And maybe they're not as good as the domestic variety, but they're still edible. And in fact, in the Shvius year, they'll have Shvius sanctity. So what happens if you have that growing? Well, in some cases, that can be considered food. So there's a related brisa, and it's going to, question it, and it's going to say, but this is difficult because if the produce is forbidden just to the worker himself, because even if a non-owner is going to fail to uproot the vegetable, and that's going to constitute maintaining Kilayim, then that's going to render the produce Kalei Karim, and it should be forbidden to everyone as well, not just to the worker. And the Gemara is going to ask questions. It's going to say, if it is permitted to everyone else, but not the worker, because of a non-owner's failure to uproot Kilayim, and that is going to now, not in that case constitute Kilayim, maintaining Kilayim, and he does not render all of that produce Kalei Karim, then it should be permitted even to the worker himself. In other words, why is it going to be allowed to everyone else, but not the worker. That seems very strange. And that's what this Baraisa is probing at. The Gemara is probing at this. And the Gemara is going to answer. It's going to say, if the worker's failure to uproot the vegetable does qualify as maintaining Kilayim, but the Baraisa does not consider the produce prohibited to everyone because it's going to be ruled in accordance with Rabbi Shimon, who's saying that a person cannot render forbidden that which is not his. Now, this is a rule that we've covered before. Rabbi Shimon in Kilayim, chapter 7, Halacha 3, 63b in the Art Scroll, is going to say that if somebody spreads grapevines over his neighbor's standing grain, he does not make it the grain prohibited for benefit. And over here, he's basically saying the same thing, that according to Rabbi Shimon, the workers, having left this as Kilayim, can't render it prohibited to benefit to everyone else because he doesn't own it. But that really is not the position of the Tanna Kama. That's the position of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who's saying that, look, you can't render things forbidden and turn things off for other people. And, especially if they don't, if the person doing it doesn't have ownership of the other person's property. So in this case, if the worker doesn't have ownership of what's growing in there, in that case, maybe some wild fennel or wild chicory or other wild things, well, he's going to be forbidden to eat it, but other people are not, because you can't forbid things for other people. That's Rabbi Shimon's view. Now, the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, although Rabbi Shimon says that a person cannot render that which is not forbidden unto others, he concedes that it is forbidden to the worker because he can render that which is not forbidden unto himself. In other words, Rabbi Shimon is basically saying that a person can mess it up for himself. And since the worker allowed Kilayim to grow, in effect, he's consenting to it becoming Kilayim, and it's going to be forbidden in total to him. Now, that's not going to be the halacha l'maisa. Anyway, the Gemara now is going to qualify the Baraisa's later ruling that when a worker maintains vegetables in a vineyard, they're going to remain permitted to others. And we're going to get into this question of this 1/200th, how do you know about that? And all of this is going to pertain to where the vegetables were then picked by somebody else. In other words, Rabbi Kanievsky in his Beur shiurim is going to say like this about the sugya, that after the worker allowed them to grow by a 200th, someone else came along and picked them. And before they increased by a 200th, he noticed them. And whether the person is the owner or a worker acting for the owner, the vegetables remain permitted to everyone except for the worker who let them grow. That's going to be how they're reading this Baraisa that's based on the logic of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And the Gemara continues, says they are forbidden to both him and to everyone else. Now, the Shenis Eliyahu is saying that this Gemara refers to a case where the worker picked the vegetables for himself, and since they constitute Kilayim, basically what this is saying is this is going to be a case where the worker is entitled to some produce as part of his compensation. And since the worker ultimately keeps these vegetables there for himself, they're going to be viewed as though they were his originally. And Rabbi Kanievsky is going to add to that in his commentary and say when he allowed them to grow a 200th, then they became forbidden to everyone as Kilayim. Now, in here, if you unpack this, you're going to have some of the opinion is going to be by the Tanna Kama, some is going to be Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And again, the question is, if can you disqualify something that is owned by someone else? And in this case, how could it be where this worker would leave some wild fennel there? Well, you're allowed to take, and the Torah guarantees that a worker who's picking the produce is allowed to take some of the produce for himself for food. And so, perhaps he's decided to maintain what's growing there. In this case, it's going to be the wild fennel or the wild chicory, which is very nice to munch on. And, he's saying, well, I'm going to come and collect it. But the problem, and really where we're going on where the Tanna Kama would say about this, is they would say, look, maintaining Kilayim and leaving it there is forbidden for everybody, not just the worker. So that if the worker, is leaving it there, yes, it's going to be forbidden to the worker, but to everyone else as well, even though it's somebody else's property. And by the way, it can also mess up the vines as well. The Mishnah is going to get into this issue about the 200th growth, and that it's going to be forbidden. That's going to be the Mishnah's conclusion. It's going to say that the Gemara explains how we're going to determine the amount of additional growth to figure out if something grew a 200th. And the Gemara says that those in the Academy of Rabbi Yanai measured the additional growth of the yarbuza plant, and Rambam is going to say that that is going to be amaranth. Rav in Shvius is going to say that's asparagus. And the Vilna Goan in his commentary to Orla 1.3 is going to say that this yarbuza plant is neither a fast-growing plant nor a slow-growing plant, but it's being picked by this academy because it's a medium growth rate plant. And the Gemara is going to explain how does one examine whether a plant increased by a 200th. And Rav Bivi says in the name of Rabbi Hanina, assuming that there are two plants growing, one plucks one of them and leaves them on the ground next to the other, and he measures the detached plant and he waits a certain amount of time and measures it again to see how much it diminished before it dries out. And the amount that this one, the detached plant, diminishes, and this one, where it's still going to be attached, is going to increase. In other words, they're mirror images. And really, through experimentation, Rabbi Yanai's students were observing, says the Chazan Ish, that when one plucks the yarbuza plant from the ground and leaves it next to something that's attached, the attached one will increase in growth at the same rate as the detached one will diminish, and that's going to be through the loss of moisture. So basically what they're ruling is that this can be applied to any plant, and then they're saying that this increase by plucking it or the decrease by plucking it, and you can figure out that if it's going to take 100 hours for the plucked plant to lose the moisture, it's going to indicate that if it lost a 200th of its moisture each half hour, we can conclude that the attached plant of that variety will be at an increase of a 200th in a half an hour. In other words, a mirror image of it. Now, there's another way to look at it and say, well, the plant doesn't turn to zero. In other words, if you have 100 grams of a plant and when it dries out, it might turn into 25 grams. So, you might have 75 grams of moisture, but, there would be a way, and the Rambam is going to be laying out a way where you can account for that based on, how much it's going to lose in water weight in, say, a half an hour. And so the Rambam is saying that the attached plant, can be prohibited, based on, how much loss the other detached plant is going to have in a period of time, and you can even do it by subtracting what the final weight would be and seeing how much the water weight is, and then using that. That's the Rambam's insight on how you can do that. And this is important because, again, we don't want to have Kilayim in here. We don't want to have where we mess up our vineyard because they're very expensive to generate and they take a lot of time to get ready. And, if you're an owner and you're leaving, a couple of wild vegetables there, it's serious. You can end up damaging your crop where you have to uproot it and burn it. Now, in Halacha 6, tomorrow we're going to be getting into what happens if we're going to be, discovering these, foreign seeds that sprouted in a vineyard by itself. And we're going to get into a definition about planting versus sprouting. And they are different. Have a great day.